Thanks very much for coming out on a cold Thursday evening. I'm doubly happy to be chairing this, not just because it's scientifically interesting, but because before I was asked to chair this, I actually bought myself a ticket, so I get my money back. And I get to hear it all anyway. The reason I bought a ticket as a punter is that I think what we're going to hear tonight is about a subject which is special for a number of reasons. One is that in terms of fundamental biology and psychology, it's one of the big open books, one of the big blank pages that we have in modern psychology and biological sciences. The second is, whereas they will discover really very interesting things in the Large Hadron Collider, but it's not going to affect your everyday life, is it? You know, you're really not going to lose any sleep over it or change the way you cook. But what these people discover and what these people work on does interface with your everyday life in a way that I think many other areas of biology and science simply do not. And I think sleep is, for that reason, and circadian rhythms are, for that reason, one of the most important subjects in modern day science. Just to give you, before I turn you over to the speakers, an indication of how important it is, we have some very accomplished people in this audience, very, very accomplished people. We have Pip Eastop, for example, one of the most important horn players in the world. Last year made a landmark recording of Mozart's horn concertos. He's played the horn and blown down a pipe every day for 40 years, for hours and hours and hours. But every 10 years or so, that adds up to his 10,000 hours. But he's actually 4 times as good at sleeping as he is at playing the horn, because every 4 years he gets through his 10,000 hours. That's how important sleep is. No matter what it is you do, what it is that drives your life, how important it is, evolution has decided to give over more time to your biological mechanisms for sleep than anything else you might want to do. We have James Smith here tonight from Sleep Deep, who's one of the people responsible for you staying up late at night watching adverts of people taking their clothes off down to their boxer shorts in laundrettes and things like that. He spent hundreds and thousands of hours working on those adverts so you can stay up and look at light screens and not get a proper night's sleep. But he's also slept several times more, 4 or 5 times more every day than he works on those things. So sleep is one of the primary functions that we've evolved to do. In fact, it might even be the point of life. I'm going to hand you over to the speakers. What will happen is, first of all, we'll hear from Stafford Lightman from the University of Bristol. Then we'll hear from Debra Skene from the University of Surrey. Then we'll hear from Russell Foster from the University of Oxford. They're going to speak to you for 15 minutes each. When they get to 16 minutes, I'll kind of go like that at you, and I want you all to go zzz, okay? Because every minute they go over time, and they're academics and nobody's told them to stop for years, every minute that they go over time is time out of the time you get to ask them those important fundamental questions that matter to you in everyday life. So Stafford, if I can hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very much the warm-up artist because I'm not primarily a sleep researcher, but I will introduce you and move you into sleep. But what I would like to talk to you about today is about rhythms. Now, I think all of you are used to rhythms. You all have rhythms of one sort or another. And I'm just going to start by bringing you back to the brain, because the brain is the bit that is involved in sleep. It's involved in almost everything that you do. My particular research is on stress, and my particular interest is how stress causes disease. And there's lots of forms of stress from your external environment or from within yourself, but these all affect a little bit of the brain, right in the middle of the brain here, part of the hypothalamus, which causes lots of changes in the way you behave, in the way your body performs. But very near to this area, which is your stress-responsive area, you've got another area. It happens to be called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but it's a little clock. And you've got a little clock there in the middle of your brain, which actually tells you where you are during your day. And it tells you when you need to go to sleep, and it tells you when you need to wake up. And this clock controls many, many things that your body does. Now, this body clock is a really powerful clock. So it lives here, and that, in fact, if you take this body clock out and you put it in a dish, and you look at it in a dish, what happens is, all on its own, without anything else going on, every 12 hours, it turns on, it turns off, it turns on, and it turns off. And actually, you can look at this, and you can actually see, this is in a dish, your body clock turning on and off every 12 hours. So you've got this that's controlling your sleep cycle, is controlling your energy, is controlling all of the things that you do, is spontaneously going on in your head every single day. So where do I fit into this? Where's my interest? Well, this little body clock up here is very close to the part of the brain that controls your stress hormones. So there's a little pituitary gland here, and so it affects your pituitary gland, which releases a hormone, which is called ACTH, which goes right round the body, and then it alights on these two little glands here, your adrenal glands, which live just above your kidneys, and these produce the stress hormone cortisol. So if we look in a little more detail here, you've got your body clock here. It produces a compound which acts on your pituitary gland, which makes the hormone ACTH, is what it's called, which acts on your adrenal gland, and your adrenal gland then makes your stress hormone cortisol. Okay, so what would you expect happens to your hormones throughout the day? What would you expect actually happens? Well, what you would expect isn't this, is it? You wouldn't expect your hormone to be the same flat throughout the day, because you know you've got a body clock, and you know that you need your stress hormones when you're awake. But actually, what happens isn't that. So you've got, this is what you would expect. You would expect the hormone to go up. So this is the daytime here, and this is the nighttime here. You would expect it to go up before you wake up, because it's an anticipatory hormone. It's a hormone that gets your body ready for the stress of waking up and everything you do in the day. You would expect it to go up in the night, to peak just as you wake up, stay up in the day, and then come down. But actually, that isn't what happens, because when you look at it, what you actually see is that. And that's really weird. That's just not what you would expect. Because actually, although there's a day rhythm, what you've got is an almost hourly rhythm of peaks of hormone. And this is really interesting, because why does your body want all these multiple oscillating levels of hormone over the 24 hours? So we wanted to know a little bit more about this. So what I've shown you is that you've got the pituitary gland. It makes a hormone called ACTH, and it acts on the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are really very strange, because most of your hormone glands can store hormone, so that when you stimulate the glands, they produce hormone. But actually, the adrenal gland cannot store hormone. It has to make it new all the time. So every time it has a message to turn on, it has to make cortisol. What that means is there is a delay between ACTH acting on your adrenal gland and the adrenal gland making cortisol. And so if I can give you an example of this, of what a delay means in a feed-forward feedback situation, it's like this. So you will recognize Burns and Smithers. And those of you who are a bit older will recognize that the type of showers you used to have, you used to go in, and it was too cold, you turned the shower off, and it went too hot, you turned it down, and it was too cold. And basically, what's happening is this. So Burns finds the shower too cold, so he yells down to Smithers, do something about it, Smithers. So he does, so he turns it up. So he turns it up, but nothing happens, because there's a delay before it comes through, so he turns up a bit more. And so as this happens, to begin with, it suddenly gets warm, just the right temperature, and then, it gets too hot. And he screams, that's awful. So poor old Smithers gets screamed at, and he turns it down, and it goes down. And he tries to get it cooler, but it doesn't go cooler, so he turns it a bit more down, and it gets a bit cooler again. And then, of course, it goes from, lovely, excellent Smithers, to being, it's too cold. And this is what happens when you've got a delay in a message system. It's a mathematical necessity. Any system like this has to oscillate. And so what actually is happening is that you get an oscillating system, and what's actually happening in the brain is that you've got activity in your hypothalamus, which is activating the hormone that goes to the pituitary. The hormone to your pituitary then goes round the bloodstream, and then when it gets to the adrenal gland, there is a delay. The adrenal gland, after a delay, makes the hormone cortisol, And when the level of cortisol goes up high enough, it quickly turns off the ACTH. So you've got what's called a feed forward and a feedback system with a delay in it. It has to oscillate. And that means your hormones have to oscillate. And that basically means that your body always, from the moment you're born, is seeing oscillating levels of your hormone, and it's adapted to it. So what you have is for the whole of your life, you have pulses of cortisol being secreted by your adrenal glands. It causes pulses to go around the whole body. And amongst other things, it causes pulses of hormone to go to the brain. Does this matter? Well, yes, it does. We have quite a lot of patients who can't make their adrenal hormones, and we give them their hormone back, and we give it to them by mouth. When we give them by mouth, they get very flat levels of hormone throughout the whole day. And a lot of these patients just say, I haven't any energy, there's nothing I can do, I just got no enthusiasm for anything, I can't do anything. So what we've done is that we have looked at patients and we've given them back their hormone either as a constant amount, so a flat amount of hormone throughout the whole day, or we've given them pulses of hormone. Then what we've done is we've put them in a scanner. And in the scanner, we've given them an emotional stimulus, which is basically looking at sad and unhappy faces, to see how their body emotionally responds, how their brain emotionally responds. So we're comparing people who've got nice pulses of cortisol to people who have flat levels of cortisol. So we put them in a scanner, and when we put them in the scanner, this is what we find. These are the patients who are given flat levels of cortisol, and when we give them an emotional stimulus, one of their amygdalas lights up just a little bit, just like that. And when we give the same people pulses of hormone, what we see is this: both of the amygdalas light up very, very brightly. So the emotional brain, the part of the brain that responds to emotion, is much more activated when it sees an oscillating signal to when it sees a flat signal. And this is very important in our patients who actually don't show normal emotional responsiveness when we give them pills. And it's another way that we have to understand that the way we treat patients, the timing that we treat patients, is every bit as important as the actual hormone we actually give them to replace it. So I've said that you've got a body clock and that the body clock controls the daily rhythm of hormones. But one of the really interesting things too is that cortisol, this particular hormone, actually affects the body clock. So let me just take you through this very quickly. This just shows you activity of a rat. And a normal rat gets very active at night time, and going up is how active it is. So it's very active. So this is 3 different days. Well, it's 1, 2, 3 days, and it gets very active at night. Then it's not active in the daytime when it's asleep. It's active at night. It's inactive during the day, and it's active at night. Similar with activity, it has a daily rhythm of body temperature. So when it's active, its body temperature goes up, and then it goes down again. It goes up and down in a 24-hour cycle. When we give these rats a constant level of cortisol, so we just give them a level of cortisol constant over the 24 hours, what happens is they lose their activity profile. They no longer have a 24-hour cycle of activity. Their activity is same throughout the whole of the 24 hours. And then if we look at their temperature cycle, that has also gone. So this major hormone, this stress hormone, which is controlled by your 24-hour clock, actually also controls the 24-hour clock. And when we give it in the wrong way, it can get rid of a lot of the activity of the 24-hour clock. So this is all about sleep. Does this have any relevance for sleep? Well, yes, it does. And I'm just going to show you, this is a sleep diagram of a human being, just to say, basically, this is a wake up here, and this is deep sleep down here. And these purple squares here are your levels of cortisol. And in a normal night's sleep, what you get is you get very low levels of cortisol throughout the night, and then when you start waking in the morning, so when you become more wake up here, your levels of cortisol go up. What happens if your sleep is disturbed? So this is a subject who's got disturbed sleep because there was a very loud thunderstorm. You'll see that rather than having flat levels throughout the night, he's having these peaks of cortisol throughout the night. They don't normally happen at night, but during this thunderstorm, they were happening all throughout the night. And then what happens to, this was a staff member who had been supervising experiments, and he was simply unable to sleep. And him, with his level, he's got pulses of cortisol actually going on throughout the whole of the night. So we know that actually high levels of these stress hormones can actually disturb your sleep, and while we also know that disturbed sleep can disturb your stress hormones. Does it matter as well? Well, this is just another example. What I showed you is that if you've got higher levels of hormones, you don't sleep so well. So what conditions do you have bad sleep in? Well, one of the classic ones is in aging. As people get older, their sleep gets much worse. And if you look, this is just averaging the levels of cortisol throughout the day, so you don't see their pulses. But if you look at a normal person, so this is the average of young people, they have very low levels of cortisol at night, which then come up again in the morning. But more older people have much higher levels of cortisol at night. So these people who have much poorer sleep also have higher levels of cortisol. So, what do I conclude? Well, I conclude that oscillations are absolutely vital for good health. Everything oscillates. I mean, really everything. Even atoms oscillate. Everything in our existence that we know about oscillates. So the stress hormone cortisol needs rhythm. It needs a rhythm as an anticipatory hormone preparing you for waking up in the morning. It needs to go up before you wake up to prepare you for all the activities of the day. But it also needs hourly cycles to maintain your optimal responsiveness. If it's not oscillating up and down, you are not as a responsive a person. Your reactivity, your emotional reactivity is not normal. And in fact, your metabolic activity isn't normal either. So it needs hourly cycles to maintain optimal responsiveness of the brain and other organs. There's also a bidirectional relationship between your cortisol, your stress hormone secretion, and sleep. So you have high levels of cortisol impair your sleep. We know that awakening is linked with increased cortisol secretion. And interestingly, if you tell somebody that they're going to wake up at a time in the morning, that in itself is enough for their cortisol secretion to go up before that time. So their expectation of waking up is actually enough to increase their cortisol. And there's increased nocturnal cortisol secretion in many conditions associated with poor sleep, including aging and depression. So that's really my introduction. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I can see The Attack of the Oscillating Hormones as a trilogy written by Stafford Lightman. Thank you very much. Debra, can you take us on from that, please? I'm not anally retentive, but that was 13 minutes and 37 seconds, if you're interested.
Great. Well, thank you, and hello, everybody. I'm just going to take on where Stafford left off, and the hormone I want to talk to you about is called melatonin, and it's synthesized in the pineal gland, which is a very small, it's the size of a pea in your brain. Descartes called it the seat of the soul, and it is where melatonin is made. Is this working? And it has a rhythm as well. And in a sense, it's the opposite of cortisol. It peaks at night. We call it the darkness hormone. In every species that we've studied, melatonin occurs at night. And it's a hormone that prepares you for the things that your species does at night. So, of course, in humans, we sleep. But animals like rodents, they're awake. So it's a hormone that is related to darkness behavior. And it is also driven by this biological clock that Stafford told you about. There it's sitting just above this optic chiasm in this area called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. And it's essentially hardwired to this biological clock. You can see the SCN here, and it's quite a circuitous route because it goes all the way down to a part of your spine and then comes back up, and these nerves innervate the pineal gland here. So what happens in the biological clock is directly informing what is happening in the pineal. And so it's driving the rhythm of melatonin. And we use this rhythm of melatonin to mark the clock, because we can't see the clock on our own. I can't tell you where your biological clock is in time, but I can measure this hormone, and by measuring it and knowing what time, for example, the melatonin begins to rise or what time the peak is, that tells me where your biological clock is in time. And so we use it as a marker of internal time, and we can use it to diagnose circadian rhythm disorders. If we suspect that you may have a disorder of the circadian system, we will measure melatonin to prove that. And the reason we like melatonin is because it's not really affected by things like showering or eating or stress or sleep or meals. So when we measure it, it's not being confounded by other external factors. We do have to do some conditions to make sure we get it right, and that is we have to sample in dim light conditions. So if we switched out these lights here and you just had enough light to read, we would be able to sample your melatonin. And for some of you, that would be beginning to rise now. We also like to exclude medication if we can. And you're all sitting down, so I could keep you here all night, and you could take saliva samples for me, and I'd be able to measure who are the late types in the audience and who are the early birds in the audience. And here are some measurements that we do in our lab down at Surrey. These are hourly blood samples, and you can see the melatonin rhythms almost like a fingerprint, because on 2 different nights, you can see that they're very similar patterns in these 4 people, except that when you look at the peak, here is 60 picograms, whereas here is only 25. So we get different amounts of melatonin, but the profile is the same for each individual. We also can measure the metabolite of melatonin. This is made in the liver, and it's got a sulfatoxy group on it, and that means we can then measure it in the urine. And by measuring the melatonin metabolite in the urine, it means we can do studies in people's homes. So we can ask you to collect urine, and then we ask you to collect all the urine over 4 hours across the day and the night, and we get a very good correlation between the urinary metabolite shown in the histograms and the plasma melatonin. So we can use it in field studies. You don't need to have blood sampling done. And there again in the lab, you can see how well the blue line shows you the hourly plasma melatonin and how well it correlates with these urine collections, even if the urine collections aren't really at equal time intervals. So now we have the tools. It's easy to measure. It's relatively cheap to measure. You do need a lab though. And it means you can get at the clock and where the clock is in time for diagnosis. It also has helped us a lot when we want to look at, for example, what's the role of the eye and what's the role of light in the circadian timing system. We know that light information is taken down this non-visual pathway to the clock, and we've been able to study that. And one of the ways of studying that is to study blind people. Now, blind people, of course, have different diseases, but they also have different amounts of visual loss. And we measure that by working out whether they perceive light, whether they can see shadows, count fingers, or whether they have no conscious light perception, so they would be unaware that the lights are on. And we found that the degree of visual loss that we see in blind people relates to whether they have sleep problems or not. The more severe the visual loss, the more high frequency of sleep problems. And we wanted to look at what is the clock like in these blind people. So here's a blind person we studied for 4 weeks, and each time we studied them, the peak time of melatonin occurred here where it should, at night, about 3 o'clock in the morning. And that person had light perception, was blind, but had some light perception. And then we can study people who have no eyes. They're bilaterally enucleated, and there you get a very different picture. We have melatonin being produced. It's peaking every time we measured it, but can you see that it peaks at a different time each time we sampled? Meaning that the clock is desynchronized from the light-dark environment because there are no eyes. And when we study bilaterally enucleated people, you can see the peaks here, the symbols here show the peak time of melatonin. And every week of the study, the peak time changed. If they were synchronized, the peak time would be here at 4 o'clock every morning. So we're having a desynchronized system, and that inferred or told us how important the light-dark cycle is, how important our regular 24-hour light-dark cycle is to synchronize the biological clock. And we know that it's ocular light. And why it's important, even for blind people, is here you see a sleep map. Here's a typical sleep diary. We ask our subject to tell us when they go to bed and when they wake up. And they also mark when they have some naps. You see SS here, Saturday and Sunday. So you're having these naps when our subject isn't working and sleeping. And you see that the melatonin rhythm, peak showing in the red stars, is synchronized and entrained. All is well because the circadian system and the sleep are together. Now look at that. Very different. This subject is totally blind, no light perception. Look at the very poor sleep, short sleep, the free-running, desynchronized melatonin you see here, and where the biological night is, you see how much more napping you get. And this slide is a sort of prototype of what blind people suffer from if they have no light perception. And it's known as non-24-hour sleep-wake disorder because it's not synchronized to the 24-hour. And it's characterized by a cyclic disorder because sometimes when that person, when their melatonin is peaking at the right time, like 4 o'clock in the morning, do you see here the very good night's sleep and no napping during the day? But when the clock moves out into an abnormal place, peaking here during the day, then you see you get lots of naps during the day and very poor night's sleep. So it's a cyclic disorder. Sometimes the sleep is good and sometimes the sleep is poor. And it shows you how important the light-dark cycle is. We need good to give us good sleep at night and for us to be alert during the day. And so when you have this mismatch between the circadian system and your light-dark cycle, for example, when you travel across time zones or when you do night shift work, you get all the symptoms that I'm sure some of you have felt. You feel tired during the day. Of course, you reduce performance, you risk accidents, and then you can't sleep when you want to at night. And so, and here's your classic jet lag situation here, where you've got to, you fly eastward, and then you've got to take some time to adapt to your new time zone, or take some time to adapt to your new work schedule. And we study shift workers in this way. We've studied people who work on the oil rigs in the North Sea. They have these 14 day shifts, and here's a person on a day shift. So they sleep at night here, their melatonin is peaking at night, all is well. And then they go on to 2 weeks of night shift, and can you see, of course they're working here during the night, and they're sleeping here on the black bars during the day. But can you see how it takes some time, about 6 days, before they adapt to the new schedule? So while they're adapting, they're suffering from symptoms of jet lag. And another sleep problem that involves the clock is what we call problems of sleep timing. Some people can't go to bed at a normal time. They go to bed very late at night and wake up very late in the day. You might say, yes, all those adolescents, all those teenagers, that's it. That's exactly what they do for that period of time, suffer from. And then inversely, some people go to bed very early and wake up early. And that is more associated with, as you get older, you tend to go to bed earlier and wake up earlier. So all of these things, as well as some other possible disorders, disorders of mood, depression, possibly aging and Alzheimer's disease, may involve clocks being dysfunctional and affect sleep. And so we've spent some time trying to work out how we can try and treat these disorders. And the two things that we currently know can work are light, appropriately timed, and melatonin. That is, as a tablet, as a drug taken, because we know they can shift the timing of the clock. And the complicated part here is that both of these compounds can advance the timing of the clock, or they can delay the timing of the clock. And it depends on when you give it. Now, that shows here, because this isn't a straight line, this is a curve. And it means that if you give light here before 4 o'clock in the morning, when your temperature is at the minimum, you'll get a delay in the timing of the clock. Whereas if you give light in the morning, you will get an advance. So it's very important to know when to give the light to do what you want to do with the clock. And melatonin is the same. If you give melatonin here, about now, if I gave you all some melatonin before the natural rise in melatonin, it will advance the clock, and if I give you melatonin in the morning, it will delay. And the trick here is that they're almost 12 hours apart, light and melatonin. So if you want to use both of these to treat circadian rhythm disorders, you shouldn't be giving them at the same time. You must take your melatonin when you're not getting a lot of light. So with wearing sunglasses, perhaps. And put more simply, melatonin here in the evening will advance your clock if you see the red line here. And that's sort of the full list of all the circadian rhythm disorders you can get. And knowing what goes wrong here means you can appropriately time your light and melatonin to correct that problem. And that's what researchers have done, and that's what we've done too. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Debra. Russell, you've got 50 minutes and 49 seconds to tell us everything you would like about.
Many thanks indeed. What I thought I'd do in the next 15 minutes, and was it 49 seconds, was to pull some of the themes that Stafford and Debra have talked about, and then drill in some detail about the mechanisms whereby the eye detects light. So let's kick off with a framework of thinking about sleep. So the first point I'd like to make, and it's been touched on by my colleagues, that a profound amount of our time is spent asleep. Across the entire lifespan, 36% of our entire lives will be spent asleep. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And to put that into some sort of context, is anybody here who's celebrating or just about to celebrate your 60th wedding anniversary? Anybody? No? Well, when you do, be aware that 21 and a half of those years, you'll have actually been asleep. So when you cut the cake, really it's not 60 that should be on it, but 38 and a half years. But the key point, of course, is that the quality of the sleep that you get will to a large extent dictate the quality of the waking day. Because sleep is not a down state. So much is going on. In fact, some parts of the brain are more active during the sleep state than the wake state. And really important biology is going on when we sleep. So memory consolidation, the ability with all this information coming in to actually consolidate it, that's absolutely critical. Sleep is critical for that. And it's not just the retention of facts, it's also the manipulation of information. Jan Born in Germany has been able to show that a night of sleep can enormously enhance our capability of coming up with novel solutions to complex problems. Now, these are kind of intuitive stuff, but now we have the scientific evidence to back it up. Toxin clearance. There's some recent stuff suggesting that beta amyloid, which has been associated with a buildup in the brain with dementia, is actually cleared during sleep. Tissue repair. The brain is regulating the release of growth hormone. Growth hormone is very important in tissue repair. And growth hormone is released during the first half of the night while we're asleep. So much tissue repair is going on there. The rebuilding of metabolic pathways that have been burnt up, as it were, during the waking state are rebuilt at night, and indeed energy replacement. So it's a really, really fundamental and important part of our biology. And no great surprise that the generation of the sleep-wake cycle involves essentially every brain neurotransmitter and multiple brain structures. You can think of the sleep-wake cycle and the generation of sleep as being a network property of the brain. It's a global brain event. And that's really important for some of the stuff that we're going to discuss in a moment. Now, in addition to this sort of set of networks that we've discussed, as I say, every neurotransmitter, multiple brain structures, you've got a range of important drivers and modulators. We've already heard from Stafford about stress. And of course, societal demands, as indicated here by the alarm clock, can have a huge impact upon the sleep-wake cycle. In a sense, society can impose a sleep-wake cycle. But if that sleep-wake cycle is out of sync with the biological desire to sleep, then you can activate the stress axis and cause real problems, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So uniquely in our species, we have essentially a societal drive that distorts sleep. The second driver and modulator is perhaps the most intuitive part about sleep, which is the longer you've been awake, the greater the need for sleep, the greater the buildup of sleep pressure. And a number of different substances have been associated with the development of tiredness. So from the moment you wake in the morning, then the sleep pressure builds up and up and up and up and up. Now, you don't fall asleep usually. Sometimes there's a mid-afternoon dip, and we may want to discuss that later, because of the other thing we've heard about already, which is the biological clock. The biological clock is essentially saying, now is the appropriate time to be awake, and now is the appropriate time to be asleep. And so what happens is the clock drives a sleep window. So as the sleep window opens up, the sleep pressure kicks in, and then you go to sleep. And of course, if the clock and the sleep pressure are out of sync, you're in problems. The clock, as we've heard, is centered around the suprachiasmatic nuclei, the SCN, and what's also extraordinary is that these are the yellow cells here, and these are the red fibers. You can take one of those individual cells out. Stafford showed you of a slice ticking away in the dish. Actually, that property of the clock exists within a single cell. So you can take one of those cells out, stick it in a dish, and you see 24-hour oscillations. And so what that tells you, of course, is that the generation of these 24-hour circadian rhythms is not essentially cell-cell interaction, some sort of circuit property, but in fact it's a subcellular molecular oscillation. And we now know quite a bit about that molecular feedback loop, and in fact tiny changes in those genes and their proteins that make the molecular clock have been associated with morningness and eveningness. So morningness and eveningness has a sort of a bit of a genetic basis as well as a developmental basis. Okay. In addition to clock cells here, essentially every cell in the body has its own clock. So what's happening is that this master clock in the base of the brain is sending a signal out to regulate the rhythmic activity of billions and billions of individual cellular oscillators scattered throughout the organ systems of the body. So you have a fantastic circadian network. And then, of course, this internal time signal is of absolutely no use whatsoever unless it's set to the external world. And as Debra was saying, the light-dark cycle perceived by the eye is the most important regulator of this internal molecular clockwork. The eye is also doing something else. It's sending projections to a whole range of structures within the brain, some of which have been associated with alertness. So when I look around the room now and I see lots of people falling asleep, I know it's nothing to do with me at all. It's the low levels of light. If I were to increase the levels of light, I would increase levels of alertness. And that is something that can have a big effect upon the sleep-wake cycle. Many people, before they go to bed, stand in the most brightly lit room in the house, cleaning their teeth. Now, that will increase levels of alertness and actually can delay sleep onset at night. Okay, what else have we got? Oh, yes, so what I want to say now is what Debra talked about, which is the pineal and melatonin, the biological marker of the dark, and we know that melatonin can feed back upon the sleep-wake cycle in important ways. In fact, in some individuals, taking melatonin at night can reduce the time it goes off to sleep by a significant amount. So melatonin is doing lots of interesting things, and as Debra said, it's a marker of the darkness and the appropriate physiology that we experience during the dark. Okay, the point I wanted to make with all of this stuff is that sleep is immensely complicated, or the sleep-wake cycle is immensely complicated, and we see huge potential for disruption. If, for example, you're a shift worker, you're misaligning activity with the biological need for sleep, and so you can activate the stress axis. If you're drinking a lot of coffee, the caffeine in coffee can block the rise of the sleep pressure. So that's how caffeine is interacting. And of course, it can delay sleep immediately. If you have an abnormal light-dark cycle, as Debra was explaining within shift workers and jet lag, this can all be horribly disrupted. And what we see, of course, is disruption of sleep, largely driven perhaps by the stress axis. You get real problems in overall health. One thing we know about increased levels of stress is it suppresses the immune system. And it may be that suppression of the immune system which is associated with higher rates of breast cancer and colorectal cancer, which have been studies in night shift nurses, higher rates of infection. Also, activation of the stress axis will increase cardiovascular problems and indeed metabolic abnormalities such as diabetes too. In addition to overall health disruption, you have the ability of the brain to process information, cognitive health, the laying down of memory, the coming up with new ideas. And finally, as we'll touch on very, very briefly, our emotional and mental health. Sleep disruption is intimately associated with mental illness, for example. And finally, of course, all of these are connected together. So you have this incredible framework of thinking about sleep within the broader context of our biology and our overall health. Now, one way to think about the association between illness and sleep disruption is depicted here. Psychiatric illness, in fact, in severe psychiatric illness such as schizophrenia and bipolar, there is immense sleep disruption. I mean, really profound sleep disruption. As you see in neurodegenerative diseases, as Debra touched upon in ocular disease, shift working, aging, and stroke and trauma. So why do you always find sleep disruption associated with these important diseases? Well, part of the explanation is that sleep and circadian rhythm disruption may arise because the neural circuits that derive normal, let's say, psychiatric behavior are also shared by the sleep systems. So a defect here that predisposes you to mental illness will actually have a defect here. So there are common and overlapping pathways. So for example, we've shown that if you take a gene that's been linked to human schizophrenia and you have a mutated form of that gene in a mouse, the mouse sleep-wake patterns start to collapse. So genes that were never associated with the clock and the sleep systems initially, when mutated, have a big effect upon the clock systems. So there's that shared pathways. That's not the whole explanation, of course, because in addition to the overlap on neural pathways and mechanisms, The psychiatric illness, via stress, social isolation, and indeed the medication, can impact upon the sleep-wake cycle, and indeed the disrupted sleep, via poor health, poor cognitive health, and again stress, can feed back and exacerbate these pathologies here. One thing that's turning out to be really interesting is that in, again, psychiatric illness, if you can partially stabilize the sleep-wake disruption in patients with schizophrenia, you can actually not only improve the overall health consequences in these individuals, but reduce, in one experiment, levels of delusional paranoia by 50%. So there's a very, very intimate relationship between these pathways here. Okay. What I want to talk about now, in the last few moments, is really to strip away this complex network and then talk exclusively on the relationship between the eye and the master clock within the brain. Now, if you think about it, we're asking the eye to perform two fundamentally different things. The familiar function of the eye is as an image detector, either a black and white, an object against its background, or indeed using color vision. And what the eye is doing is grabbing light in a fraction of a second, forgetting it's seen it, and then is using that information to build up an image of the world. But that's not the sort of information the clock wants. The clock wants an overall impression of the amount of brightness in the environment at dawn and dusk so that it can regulate internal time. And these are very, very different sensory tasks. And way back in the early 90s, we began to ask the question, well, how the hell can the eye do this? How can the understood function of the eye as an image detector also allow reliable brightness detection? And so we took another look at the eye. And just to orientate you, what you see here is the eye. And we've taken a little section here, which is the retina. And you see these are the visual cells, the rods and the cones, the rods providing us with our black and white vision, and the cones are color vision. And then there's various layers. These layers here are associated with the first processing of the visual image. And then these are the ganglion cells, and then they collect this information and fire this information into the brain via the optic nerve. And we started to study mice with different ocular diseases. But let me give you some background first. Here we have our mouse. Here we have a light-dark cycle. Here we have a normal retina. And you see it's a nocturnal animal, so it's active, broadly speaking, when it's dark, and it's asleep when it's light. Now, how do we know it's the eye? Well, if we cover up the eyes, this ability to entrain the circadian system is gone, and the clock will drift through time. And the mouse clock is a bit shorter than 24 hours, so it gets up a bit earlier and earlier and earlier and runs in its running wheel. Now, we used a whole bunch of different sorts of mutants whereby the rods and cones had been affected and the animal was visually blind. And what was extraordinary is that you can lose large numbers of these rods and cones, and you can still regulate the clock. And this really puzzled us. And even back in the early 90s, we were thinking, well, maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something else in the eye. And when we proposed that, there was huge opposition. The argument was, we've been studying the eye for 150 years. Are you seriously telling us we've missed an entire class of light sensor? And what's more, your experiments aren't that good, because actually you haven't wiped out all of these cells. There are still a few left, and that's probably all you need to regulate the clock. So finally, we used a mouse model whereby all of the rods and cones had been eliminated. These animals showed no visual responses whatsoever. They had lost all of those cells. And so the question is, without any vision, without any rods and cones, what would happen to the animal's ability to regulate its clock? And to our intense pleasure, we saw that they could regulate with perfectly normal sensitivity. And then the argument was, well, okay, you've removed the rods and cones, but something else outside the eye has taken over. So what we, of course, had to do was put the old black glasses on again, and the animal free ran. So very clearly, there must be another light sensor within the eye. And so what the hell is it? If it's not the rods and cones, what have you got left? And we now know that it's these ganglion cells. About 1 in every 100 of the ganglion cells is directly light sensitive, these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And they are exquisitely sensitive to blue light. So when you're looking at this screen now, your photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are getting really quite excited. And it's this signal that is primarily responsible for regulating the clock. And there are, as Debra said, major clinical implications for this. We, like Debra, have been looking at visually blind individuals. Visually blind individuals, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've lost your ability to regulate the clock. So visual blindness does not necessarily mean clock blindness. But sleep and 24-hour rhythms abnormalities are largely ignored in clinical ophthalmology. So I've been working with my colleagues in the eye hospital in Oxford and around the country, and we've been looking at a whole range of eye diseases at an exquisite level of detail. And I won't show you the specific results, but I will just show you the broad conclusions. So there are two classes of patients. There are patients with visual cell loss, like our rodless, coneless mice, but they've still got the photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Now, normally what's happening is that the clinician will say, well, I'm sorry, you're blind, there's nothing more I can do with you, that's it. What they should be saying is expose, if these receptors are still here, and it's fairly easy to see if they're still active, then these individuals need to expose their eyes to sufficient daytime light to regulate their sleep-wake cycle. It gets worse, actually. Because of an ignorance about these cells, there's been a tendency to say, well, your eyes are no use to you. You can't see to look after your eyes. They're going to be a source of infection. It's so much simpler if we just pop them out and put a couple of those in, because then it'll be so much simpler. And of course, what unwittingly the clinician might have done is, of course, they've already lost their sense of space, but then, of course, they've lost their sense of time. They'll drift through time for the rest of their lives and experience essentially unremitting jet lag. And the second group of patients, of course, they'll have their rods and cones, but as in severe glaucoma, the inner retina is gone, so the rods and cones can't talk to the brain, and indeed those photosensitive ganglion cells have been lost. But as Debra said, all is not lost. One can, in these individuals, consolidate sleep-wake to some extent with melatonin, and there's a whole raft of new drugs on the horizon. So the last slide and the last point I want to make is that clinical ophthalmology must appreciate that the eye provides us with both our sense of space and our sense of time. And this is a great example of how a fundamental question-driven bit of research, how the hell does the eye regulate internal time and the sleep-wake cycle, has led to the discovery of a completely new photoreceptor system within the eye, and is now changing our understanding of the nature of the blindness, and indeed in the clinical realm, how you might treat blindness and the advice you give to patients suffering severe ocular trauma. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.